My name is David Robinson. Okay, I teach economics at Laurentian University. Written a couple books, get in the newspaper from time to time. Current project is poetry, actually.
So David, you're a teacher.
Yeah.
You started at Fission so long ago on the West Coast. What's the progression for you from being a teacher to being an activist?
There's a couple of pieces that stick in my mind. One is that I was interested in economic development in BC, which is a resource economy. And when I came here, I was struck by the fact that there was so little in the economics department or in the university where people were actually paying attention to Northern Ontario as a resource economy. And there was a kind of accident, and that is when Denison decided to shut down their mine at Elliott Lake. I thought, my gosh, we really have to track what happens to the people who are laid off. And so I started a project that ran for 8 years, Elliott Lake Tracking Study, which meant that for those 8 years I was traveling up to Elliott Lake with people, and we did 6 or 8 rounds of interviews with over 1,000 people and saw what happened when a resource town shuts down its main resource industry. And that made me a kind of local expert on the resource economy, quite accidentally. One result of that was that someone asked me to talk about the economy of Sudbury, how it was doing, to do an assessment of it for a conference that was here on clusters back at the very beginning of 2002, something like that. And so I did that. I got a colleague to work with me. We came up with 23 different indicators. They were all bad. So they ran a second round at this conference, and I was asked to say what progress we'd made. And of course, there wouldn't have been any significant progress on things like smoking or newspaper reading. But the fellow who asked me said, okay, somebody's got to tell the truth, but try to say one nice thing. And after racking my brain, I started saying, well, this is a real, possibly globally significant mining cluster.
Sorry, do you mind if I pause you? Okay, great.
So let's pick up the story. We're talking about moving from being a teacher, an activist, an economist, to, or rather from being a professor to being an activist and
Right.
and learning. So let's pick it up like your Elliott Lake experience and then go forward as
Well, we ran this Elliott Lake tracking study for 8 years, and in some ways it was a big success. The economy switched and StatsCan changed over that time, and so in some ways it wasn't as big a success as we hoped academically, but it put a fair bit of money for interviews and so on into Elliott Lake, which was a kind of neat result. And I learned a lot about the northern economy in the process. So it was, I was sort of the natural person for someone to ask to talk about how Sudbury was doing. And when I said it was doing really badly by all of these standard measures and got asked to say something again, that's when I started noticing first the mining cluster. We have this enormous integrated operation. We've got government offices, we've got research offices at the university. And I was really shocked that nobody had put that together and said, hey, this is what they call a cluster in the economic literature. And I did ask some people in the provincial government who were supposed to be in charge of economic development, and they said, no, there's no cluster there, which was a little bit annoying. And then a guy who's really well known here, Paul Reed, said to me, hey, David, wake up. You're missing something really important. There's all these small companies that are producing for the mining sector and the forestry sector. And when I saw that, I started arguing that we had a mining supply cluster here that was really important. You may remember that there was a lot of talk about transitioning away from mining. But what had really happened, if you looked at the economy more carefully, is the city was actually diversifying around mining. It was easy to see the university had grown, that the tax center had come in, but the driver of the economy was increasingly these firms. And when I said that, a lot of people got mad at me. And kind of by accident, another bright local guy said, would you like to have $70,000 to do some research on this sector? I think what's emerging when you start to see that is people in the community using a local academic, pulling someone in and asking them to talk and think about it. And I think that's actually probably a better explanation of how I ended up as an effective activist in Sudbury, was that people pulled me in rather than that I elbowed my way in or anything of the sort. A whole range of people welcomed the contribution and encouraged me and asked me to talk to the Economic Development Board and the Chamber of Commerce and so on. You, Michael, asked me to take on pieces and do things. And I think it was that feature of the community that made me an academic activist more than something. I guess I was more willing to do it than most of my colleagues. But I do think it was the community that did it.
What were some of the direct results of your research on the cluster?
Well, the first one was that we found 150 companies that were supplying mining. Paul had thought there were 70. So that was a surprise. It was a surprise for everyone. Another one is that they were exporting half of their product out of Sudbury. And that means that they were bringing lots of money in. A third one was that, and Paul Reed said this, you know, these guys are too busy making money to get organized. And part of the reason why the federal government and the provincial government didn't recognize what was here is because there was no organization, there was no magazine, there was all the things that they would use to recognize an industrial cluster, besides firms actually making money, because they couldn't see that. My picture of it is that the bureaucrats didn't have someone to talk to. If you're a bureaucrat, you want to come in and ask somebody who's in charge of this sector, the organization head or the journalists who know about it. Well, that hadn't happened. These companies had grown up from the grassroots and had become really the most significant part of the economy without anyone noticing. So, well, that's when I called you and said, hey, you may remember, I asked you, I said, you can make some money starting a magazine. And you told me, no, I can't. And
There was a lot of truth to that.
Well, I was absolutely right, sure. But then, when I said what we really need to do is fake it for a year so they believe we're here, you said I'd put some money into doing that. And Dick DiStefano, I phoned him and said, Dick, we need an organization. Could you get 10 guys and fake it for a year so they'll believe that there is a cluster here? And Dick did that. And as you know, the magazine is still going and Dick's organization is still going, and people now accept that we have the third largest mining supply region in Canada. Not only that, we're competing with Toronto, which has, 8 million people scattered over an enormous area. We have the most concentrated and probably the most creative mining supply cluster in the country. Well, that's become kind of something that's acknowledged. And you can see it's a lot of my part in that was just luck and talking about it and people saying, hey, I'll give you some money to do some research. Hey, I'll work on this with you.
One of your next adventures was to be interested in a school of architecture. You were a principal mover in that. Unusual, a professor would put his hand up and somehow move for something like this. Can you tell us that story?
Well, you know the starting point in that because you took me up to meet 6 mayors in, it wasn't the Sioux. I think we went,
Chaplow.
it was Chapleau, yeah. And on the way, when I said there was nothing you could do about the decline of the forestry sector, you said, well, give me another answer. Which is a great question. And part of the answer to that was we don't add value to the wood product. That's just basic economics. You export what you have a surplus of. We have lots of wood. We have very little capacity to add value. The obvious answer, partial answer to that was, well, you've got to have more design capacity and craft capacity. And so I suggested on the trip and then to the mayors that we needed an industrial design school in Northern Ontario to work with wood. And that seemed like a great idea. The mayors voted in favor of it. Even Sudbury City Council voted in favor of it. I did a little bit of lobbying for it. But it was really going nowhere until my daughter suggested, well, maybe we could get a school of architecture. And the reason a school of architecture is interesting is because it could be done from the university. We could sell it as something in the downtown. But something like a school of architecture brings in a lot of provincial money. So it's an economic development strategy as well for the city as well as for the region as a whole. And it turned out a lot of people really liked that idea. Took a while, but we sort of engineered 3 meetings here. One with the Chamber of Commerce, one at the university, and one with the art gallery people. And when we were done, the guy who was the head of the School of Architecture in Waterloo, who was an acquaintance of my daughter's, who I'd talked to, had convinced everybody this was a great idea. The mayor was on board from one of the meetings, not committed, but excited by the idea. And so my friend Derek Wilkinson put together a steering committee. Up until that point, he'd been really skeptical. He put together a steering committee. He picked brilliantly. Again, the capacity in the community was there. He picked a member of the city council, Janet Gasparini, and he picked a freshly retired architect, lead architect, who had terrific organizing skills, and several younger architects who were enthusiastic, and so on. And that committee worked so well that within a year, we had the city council committing $10 million to the project. I sort of thought it would take about 2 years to do. It took us about 5. Everybody says that this is just an astonishing performance. But it was the community that bought in again. And, you know, I can take lots of credit for coming up with the idea and basically sparking the committee and writing the business plan and so on. But you just have to say that all of these different people were crucial to moving it along. That there were 10 places where it could have fallen flat, where somebody came through and did what we needed. And I ended up just enormously impressed with some sort of Sudbury spirit that was here, some sort of willingness to do things, despite the fact there's an amazing amount of reaction and confusion in the community too. Does that sort of answer the question?
So, you've been an activist in many ways. What are some of the other things that you've advocated for in the university and arts and film and all sorts of things? What else have you been active, which is somewhat outside of teaching economics, that just happens to be your nature and you've gone at it?
Well, I have a book on community forestry, the economics of community forestry, which is just intended to support groups trying to advance community forestry. I'm pretty well convinced that the tenure scheme that we have in Ontario is actually holding back Northern Ontario very seriously. So that's a contribution to activists as an economist, as a professional economist. My daughter's had connections with something called Pat the Dog, which promotes playwrights. And so we discovered this trick when we got the architecture school going, which is you bring somebody in and you introduce them to everybody so that they feel like they belong as part of the community. That's what we did with Rick, the architect from Southern Ontario. He just felt like this was home and the architecture project was his. So we did that with the head of this organization, Pat the Dog. I just introduced her to everybody in the art community, and so she set up an operation here of Pat the Dog where they come in and they do a series of readings of locally produced plays and workshops for the local writers. And what I like about that is we're actually developing the capacity to produce a local literature here. And I don't believe you get economic development without the cultural development, without a kind of self-consciousness. So this is a piece of it. That, among other things, led to being invited to participate in the founding board of something called Gallery 6500. It's sort of progressively oriented little gallery that works out of Steelworkers Hall. And we've done a series of exhibits there. Pretty low-key, not super successful, but a nice idea.
What is it about Sudbury that sparks imagination with all of this activity? Either you were drawn in, or you pulled, or you pushed, or whatever, but there's something magical about this community that started with regreening and moved through an enormous number of accomplishments. How does Sudbury do it, in your mind? You've lived it.
On some level, I don't know, but there are some things that are kind of clearly part of the process. One of them is a history of activism, and it's social and union activism. Another is, if you go back to the 50s and 60s and early 70s, this was very much a community of immigrants and immigrant groups, and there were all these organizations here. It's before my time. But you had a couple things happening through that period. One was all of these groups and contests among them, right? When I arrived here, you would still hear stories about the Italian boys beating up the French boys for trying to date their sisters. You'd hear, I came in and there were all these stories about steel workers beating up mine mill workers and vice versa. It was a tremendously divided but tremendously energetic community in lots of ways. Strikes, dramatic stories. And then in the 70s, it stopped. So you had this period of really rapid growth, very ambitious ideas. We'll get a university, we'll get an art gallery, we'll get a symphony, we'll get everything. We're going to be a big, sophisticated city. And then in 75, basically it stops. Growth stops, everything stops. Two things happen there. One thing that I think is really important is the tensions within the community start to decline. It starts to become a place where people have lived here a long time. They're not all newcomers. The union battles decline in importance. It becomes a more middle-class community with universities and other operations. And there's something in that prepared the ground, I think, for a kind of new generation of activity. I don't think I really understand it. I wasn't here for all of it. But trying to reconstruct it, you have to understand the dynamism and the energy and the conflict up until the 70s. You have to say, well, that conflict is gone. Look at the Bridge of Nations, for gosh sake. This city is proud of having somebody from every country in the world here now. That's different from 1975, as nearly as I can tell. You've gone from being essentially a one-industry town to a more integrated community. As the mining employment drops, different kind of industrial development arises. The university is now one of the major revenue sources for the city. Those changes somehow made room for a kind of more imaginative and collaborative society here, I think.
And Jackie, jump in whenever you want to ask a question. Your students,
Mm-hmm.
have you been able to transfer your energy and your excitement about being an activist to some of your students? Have your students changed over the years? What are you seeing as, in your day job, your teaching job, what do you see and what have you done with students related to activism?
Over the years, I've had one or two students, most years, that are really interested in things and work with me on projects. Not so much this last year or two. For maybe 3 years, I haven't been doing quite so much of that. And those students are now moving into interesting places, managing different organizations around the city, for example. And some of them have been terrific. They've just been really clever, energetic. Not necessarily my economics students. One of my best was a history student who worked with me when I was director of INORD for a couple of years. And he's applying for a job heading up some new mining technology operation at Cambrian now. But it's been fun to watch him move into positions of more and more influence. And whenever we get together, he thanks me for those couple of years of being able to look at bigger pictures and spend more time. And that was some of the best times for me, these students that I would work with one or two at a time through the summer. Last few years, we kind of got swamped with international students. So one year I had 80% of my classes were mainland Chinese kids. There is not as much of a chance to pull people into doing things in that case. And then for the last 5 years, we've been swamped with Saudi students. And they're interesting and it's important to work with them. And lots of them are lovely. They're typically not really well prepared and they're not going to hang around. So that has kind of thrown me off of bringing kids into the community in some sense.
Okay. The last sort of energy source in your life that I've seen is you run for the Green Party twice.
Yes. Twice? 3 times, I think.
3 times.
Is it 3 times? Yeah.
Why?
Can you restate that also? Can you say that you ran for the Green Party 3 times? Because I won't hear his voice when I'm editing it.
Okay. Well, I did run for the Green Party 3 times, and I ran for the Green Party 3 times because I'm terrified about where the world's going. The biggest issue that we face right now is climate change. Our politicians have largely failed. I'm really happy that the Liberals have brought in a carbon tax. We have targets that their current strategies will take us halfway to meeting the targets, and the targets are halfway to the targets that were set by Paris. So that's a quarter of what we need to do. And the scientists all around the world are really clear. We need to do 4 times as much to bloody well survive. And so I thought the Green Party was a way to make that point in public. And that's what I'm doing. Now my daughter's running down in Waterloo. One of my daughters.
So politics, events, activities, what are you going to do next?
I'm going to publish a book of poetry. That's my next sort of private project. And I'm working on a couple of academic projects. One of them is trying to figure out how public opinion is formed. And my daughter who is a systems design engineer, is writing the programs for a model that will let us look at if you introduce ideas more widely or less widely, if there are people who are paying thugs to lie, what does that do to getting something like a climate change decision through? So we're trying to model that formally. And that's lots of fun.
I do kind of uncomfortable. Do you need to move at all? I can adjust it.
I'm okay,
You're
actually.
good? Okay,
Yeah.
good. Can you tell me a bit about this building?
This building.
Yeah. So this, then say like you're talking about the School of Architecture.
Okay, well, this building is 3 buildings, or maybe even 4 if you want to think more carefully about it. We're in a building that was the old Telegraph building. It was kind of one of the central places in the city. So, old bank across the street, for example, the theater just over here. Elm Street is the main street of the city. Durham, block over, is probably the most active street in the whole region. So it's a very central place. Railway runs right down here. We actually didn't know we would get this building when we started the process. We went through the architecture, the committee that was doing the search for a place, hired various consultants and looked at virtually every building in the downtown because we had committed from the very beginning to having the school downtown for the sake of developing the downtown. Eventually, this property, which was the CEP property, had an old warehouse on it that had, it was a pretty ugly looking building in lots of ways, but neat, heavy timber beams and big open space in the middle that was just a warehouse, a truck warehouse. And this building, the Telegraph, and a lot of parking on it. And ultimately the warehouse building and the parking lot came to be our first choice for the location for the school. And then with a bit of luck, and were you around for that, Terry? We ended up also getting this building. It was a purchase that wasn't intended in the original thinking. And this was a wonderful opportunity to renovate a well-built, interesting, historic building and put it back into real use, dynamic and exciting use. And you can see the space is wonderful. I love things like this light up here made out of old fluorescent tubes. And this big table, which is actually designed by a friend of mine who was here in on conversations even before we got the first committee going. It's a guy who ran a small wood shop. And he was just terrifically excited about the idea. And he's now still working in the wood shop teaching students how to use the tools. But he designed this absolutely wonderful building that opens up and has not the building, but this huge wood table. I don't know if that touches some of it. Down the hallway, there's a bunch of offices for the faculty here. Nice little office. In fact, I am really resentful of the fact that these guys all got nicer offices than I have out at the university. Every single person on this architecture faculty has a better space than I've had in the whole 30 years I've been here. That's not fair, is it?
So we talked about it a little bit before, but what is it that drives you to want to make things happen? Like, where does that come from?
Honestly, I don't think I know. I mean, it's got to be some sort of impulsiveness. It's got to be some sort of being caught by ideas. It's got to be some sort of arrogance about, I figured this out, it's right, everybody has to listen to me. It's got to be some of the excitement of working with people on things. But I don't know what mix or what it is. And when I try to go back and track it down, what kind of person was I as a high school student or something, I think of myself as sort of goofy and shy, not as somebody who does stuff like this. So I don't know how it happened. I'm sorry. Get a psychiatrist for questions like that.
And do you think that having the School of Architecture in this such a prominent downtown location, do you think it's changed anything about the downtown and the city, just having this being here and connected?
Yeah. Before the school came up even, my daughter, who was doing her engineering undergraduate degree at Waterloo, discovered this, what's it called, design organization down in Toronto that was running a competition for ideas about winter cities. And she decided she wanted to do something, and so she ended up designing a sort of tent for Durham Street over here, which would make it usable and habitable for people who might have difficulty walking, or in strollers for people with babies. All you can do here in the winter is go to the mall. The city piles snow up on both sides of every street, so you can't even get out of your car. And if you wanted to make a successful winter city, you would have to make it walkable and comfortable in the winter. And one way to do it, she decided, was to put this wonderful DuPont plastic elastic stuff over the whole street and basically turn it into a downtown mall. I still think it's a brilliant idea. But in the process, we started measuring and looking at the buildings all up and down Durham. And one thing that was really striking is that we lost a building recently. If you knock out a number of the buildings on a street, it stops being walkable and usable. People stop using it. That's one of the things that urban designers tell you. We'd lost buildings, we had other buildings that were empty. And back of the buildings from Durham Street on the west, there was nothing left but parking lots in a lot of places. Essentially, the city was crumbling from the west. The downtown was crumbling. And so her idea was maybe we could figure out a way to save Durham Street. It was that sort of notion that the downtown needed some anchors west of Durham Street and needed some new kinds of life that made us, we made the decision that school was going to be downtown before we told other people. My daughter and I made that decision. It was an urban planning decision we weren't entitled to make, and we made it. And when we started trying to sell the idea of the school, it was really relatively easy to convince people that adding 300 students and another 40 faculty members and technical people and so on would bring back to life much of this area. And it's true, people downtown wanted that. Downtown organizations were excited about it. Some members of council were excited about it. There had not been anything resembling a solution suggested to the crumbling of the downtown. And the architecture school seemed to satisfy that need. That's why City Council committed, what's part of the reason City Council committed $10 million over 10 years to the school. If the City Council had not done that, the university would not have accepted the school. The reason that they finally accepted after the president at the time said no, was that she could not face giving up $10 million. I mean, I think that's basically what happened. So in a sense, the school became the city's most successful urban renewal project since the Rainbow Center.
So, in thinking about things like economic development and urban planning, do you consider those things to be activism? Or a form of such?
Yeah, so, well, obviously it is. It did something.
Can I get you to restate it with the words in there? Not if you don't think that that's true, but just with more specifics, because when I'm editing it, you won't hear me talking. So,
Okay. I think that urban design is one of the most important things for the success of a community and the quality of people's lives. I was in architecture school for a while, way back around 1970. So I'm a dropout. You know, I'm a failed architect, which may have explained why this was such a great project for us. But that issue takes a lot of work. It is one of the most important areas of activism going on around the country, is how are we going to redesign our cities? How are we going to make them more livable? How are we going to deal with, in the big cities, the increasing population pressure? Toronto's adding 1 million people every 2 years or something like that. It's the most dynamic city in North America right now. We have to solve these urban design problems. And I guess it fits with my economic interests. Public finance and public economics questions overlap a lot. So it's kind of natural to try and push in what seems like the right direction. Is that an answer to the question, is this concern with urban issues about activism? Well, yeah, it really is about making a better country, and people have to work on it.